Welcome back to Directly Current, presented by EVs for All America. I'm your host, Max Patton. One of the biggest promises of electric vehicles isn't just the convenience of plugging them in at home, or no emissions, or American jobs that we love to talk about here. It's actually the ability of them to maybe be part of the solution to a power grid that's looking more and more strained than ever, between the rise of AI data centers, as well as general demand growth in areas with aging infrastructure and rapidly rising power bills. It sounds counterintuitive because you may have read news stories about electric vehicles being unfeasible on America's aging grid. Zach Woogen, the executive director of the Vehicle Grid Integration Council, has a different kind of vision. He represents a nonprofit trade association who works with all kinds of vehicle manufacturers and charging manufacturers to imagine an energy ecosystem which can leverage EVs. Because think about it, most cars spend about 80 to 90% of their time sitting in a garage or in a driveway. If you can leverage the big battery of an electric vehicle to potentially export power back into your home or supplement grid power, you could stabilize a lot of energy distribution. Keen listeners may remember last summer when we spoke with Apoorv Bhargava, the CEO of WeaveGrid, who is working with lots of energy utilities on what's called managed charging. That's what nerds like to call V1G, or basic vehicle grid integration. V2G, acronym soup, I know, is vehicle to grid, the idea that these vehicles could export power and be a resource. It depends, of course, on a bunch of standards, agreements, and good old-fashioned policy and laws to make this work in all kinds of localities across the country. That's exactly the kind of work that Zach is doing. Can't wait to speak with him about it. So I really enjoyed this. It's an optimistic look at the future of EV technology, or the present, depending on the pilot program and where you live. But Zach has a lot of bright ideas, and he has a lot of insights from working with state regulators and folks with policy stakeholding across the country on this. Can't wait to speak with him, so I'll let him take it away.
Yeah, thanks, Max. Thanks for having me and expressing interest in discussing vehicle grid integration. It's an exciting topic and one that I'm happy to be here today to discuss.
Yeah, so lots of folks, we have EV nerds who listen to the podcast. We have folks who are interested in this energy space, and yet they may not be familiar with the idea of vehicle to grid. Maybe they've seen the V2G acronym. Maybe they've seen also vehicle to load, vehicle to home, or other features that are oftentimes advertised on models. Can you just introduce people to the idea of what a bidirectional vehicle in terms of an EV is, and what kind of, broadly speaking, services vehicle to grid can enable?
Sure, happy to dive into that. I'll start by, at a high level, describing vehicle grid integration, or VGI. There's a whole acronym soup, but VGI is the umbrella term for all the ways that electric vehicles can interact with the grid in a way that supports the grid and unlocks additional value from EVs. So this includes not only bidirectional charging, which I think we'll probably focus on mostly today. It's an exciting topic, but also managed charging or optimized charging or smart charging, sometimes called V1G. There is tremendous opportunity and low-hanging fruit in just shifting when and maybe where all that EV charging load occurs and its impact on the grid. So I wanted to at least mention that. We may or may not come back to it because, again, a lot of the questions come up around bidirectional charging because it's a little bit newer technology set and something that the market is starting to orient around increasingly, as you mentioned. Companies like General Motors and Ford, Tesla, Toyota, and several others who are rolling out their solutions for bidirectional charging. You referenced a few of those acronyms. Bidirectional charging could be used to provide power to the grid, or rather provide power when you are connected to the grid, but it could also be used to provide power off grid or when you're isolated from the grid or islanded from the grid. So that could be to back up a home, for example, during a power outage. So there's these two distinct use cases that we think about at VGIC, which are to support the grid or be grid tied or grid connected, and to be isolated or islanded from the grid and support other things like backup power.
Nice. Thanks for giving a bit of lay of the land there. I'll refer to your mentioning V1G, that basic vehicle grid integration of managed charging. I think last summer we had an Apoorv from WeaveGrid. They do a lot of great work, particularly with that space where you're mentioning low-hanging fruit. The bidirectional stuff, I think, compels people because whether you're talking about that backup mode or that more grid parallel mode you were talking about. I think when we're looking at like energy prices, affordability, all these being concerns, I think this is a capturing the imagination of lots of people, even many of them being outside of like traditional EV nerd world. I think people are starting to realize, hey, if a vehicle is a massive battery reservoir, that not only can I control when I charge it, but I could output power from it directly to my home or to some kind of net metering approach. Maybe that's really helpful. But of course, there's challenges in that because you have to interface with utilities. So can you set up a little bit of like the structure of you guys at VGIC? Who do you advocate for, or who do you work with when we're looking at like utilities, regulators, all of the companies like General Motors and Tesla who are making these vehicles, in some cases, the charging systems that enable this? Like, how do you guys work within that ecosystem?
Yeah, great question. So VGIC or Vehicle Grid Integration Council, VGIC for short. We're a national trade association. So we represent many of the automakers, charging companies, the aggregators. You mentioned WeaveGrid, they're one of our members, and several others in that space. All of these companies are unified around this common goal to unlock the flexibility of EV charging and perhaps discharging as well. And what we do is primarily research, education, and advocacy in the policy space. And in practice, that ends up being a lot of work with utilities and with the utility regulator. So most states have a utility commission. Sometimes it's called a public service commission or a commerce commission, or there's different terminology. But at the state level, large investor-owned utilities are regulated by this commission, and those regulators set the rules of the road for various utility policies and rules, right? Interconnection, for example, which is answering the question, can I connect my system to the grid? That's something that is maintained and implemented by the utilities, but the rules are often actually set by the utility regulator. Rate design is another topic where the regulator actually has a great deal of impact on the utility rates. They are approving those large investor-owned utility rates. And you mentioned net energy metering, for example, as a type of policy where a utility commission might be approving the implementation of that export rate, right? That payment for, or that credit rather, for kilowatt hours set back to the grid. And so our work, because we want to create this market and address the primary barriers, our work does often focus at those utility commission proceedings. So it's very in the weeds policy intervention. It is not that high level lobbying on Capitol Hill. Maybe it is more ensuring that these detailed, sometimes quite technical, but still politically charged issues are sorted in a way that enables customers to use their vehicles to provide power to the grid or even for managed charging.
Yeah, that's interesting what you laid out there, right? That a lot of these challenges are at this kind of local, more minute level where utility regulation happens, particularly at the state level, but even in some cases, even more locally than that, depending on how a state runs. And so, like, we're not looking at high level federal policy, we're looking at pretty standard hearings and processes to get things approved. And that's my suspicion of, I remember seeing roughly 14, 15 years ago when the first Nissan Leaf came out with CHAdeMO, right? Different standard. That vehicle was advertising bidirectional capability. Now, of course, I think that was more implemented at the Asian market with the way their grids work and their regulations. However, seeing that this technology has been promising for a while and yet there's seemingly been barriers, I suspect some of that is just the fact that this is like a bunch of different little battles playing out, and you have to explain a lot of things to a lot of different parties. So is that part of it? And what are maybe some of the other barriers or roadblocks to getting like wide adoption of this tech?
Yeah, I think so. I think the Nissan Leaf is actually a great example to use to explain why some of this stuff isn't moving faster. I drive an EV. I'm sure a lot of listeners to this do too. And I sense a frustration when I talk to people that they're like, I have this huge battery sitting in my driveway. It's 80 kilowatt hours. My bill is super expensive from my utility. Like, why can't I do this? It's very frustrating. And in California, I think there's been about 35,000 Nissan Leafs sold since they turned on that sort of bidirectional capability. That was in the model year 2013 after the Fukushima disaster and crisis in Japan. And there hasn't really been large scale adoption of that configuration, of that bidirectional charging configuration, even though the capability was out there with that CHAdeMO standard you mentioned, because there was really no rate or program. There was no way to monetize this large battery that you have. So that is certainly a big barrier. And I mentioned that earlier, right? The rate design, the program design, right? Can you go to your utility and say, I want to optimize my own consumption? In other words, I want to charge my vehicle battery when electricity is inexpensive. Then when electricity is expensive, rather than buying power from the utility for my home, I want to just take the power from my vehicle battery and use that in my home. So that sort of time of use optimization or behind the meter bill optimization is something that there needs to be the right rate design in place for that to happen. And then taking it one step further, we need those export credit opportunities and say, yes, I'd love to meet my home load, but that's only 1-2 kilowatt peak load, right? I have a lot more availability and capability to sell power back to the grid or send power back to the grid past my own consumption. And then maybe we could do that instead of turning on these gas-fired power plants or these fossil-fueled power plants, right? So there's not just the environmental benefit of that, but potentially a big cost benefit to the system where you don't need to maybe keep online some of these older plants, these older fossil-fueled power plants that may not still be economic, or that we might be able to be more economic in getting that power from a customer's vehicle battery. The other barrier is something we're starting to see now, which is we're moving from some of these one-off technology demonstrations where we put stuff in the field and we say, does it work? Into larger scale deployment pilots where we're putting in 50 to 100 sites. So in California, Connecticut, Massachusetts, for example, there are programs in all of those states right now that are looking to deploy heavily subsidized bidirectional charging systems. And in doing so, surface some of these other areas of friction, right? Things that only through this larger scale deployment do we start to learn, okay, are we talking to customers the right way? Are we talking to and training installers the right way? Are our rules around interconnection, or our processes rather, are they up to the level they need to be to process these applications? Have we considered all the interactions between these bidirectional charging systems and maybe rooftop solar systems that a lot of customers, especially early adopters in this space, might have? And I think it's very exciting to see these larger scale deployment pilots move forward because we're surfacing some of these other barriers that we've long since thought about, but we're now able to really identify, okay, what is the core challenge that we need to address and how do we start addressing it? I can list out like even more barriers, but I think it's more interesting to think structurally that we're in this transition from these one-off, does it work type of science experiment to larger scale, how do we build the ecosystem doing a dozen and then 100 and then 1,000 and 10,000 of these, and what do we learn from doing that, and how can that drive us to mass market scale and not even having to use the P word anymore. No more pilots, right?
Yeah, no, the scaling is super exciting, and getting this to be more of a like broad, I would say fleet level, but it's not fleets. Ideally, this is something in people's homes, but like a broad consumer-based level thing. When you're looking at markets though, where it makes sense to have a pilot potentially, are you looking at like EV early adopter markets where there's high penetration? Because I've also heard from on the regulator or the utility side of things, there's a lot of hand wringing around, oh, there's so many EVs, they all charge at the same time. This is like a liability on the grid. And here you're talking about a grid asset, but like when you're looking at that, are you looking at high EV penetration? Are you looking at places where the infrastructure, like you mentioned, sometimes you need those peak gas plants that may be older and maybe dirtier and more expensive to run? Is it places where the generation or distribution is a little more out of date and where they can benefit? Is it a combination of both? What makes a great candidate right now for this kind of evolution phase of getting to larger scale?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think for your EV nerd listeners, which again, I say affectionately because I'm also, I think, an EV nerd, it's worth noting that for coming from also a grid nerd, that the electric grid and the electric power sector is going through a generational change right now. For the first time in decades, we're seeing growth in our load, right? And our needs for electricity, our demand. And it's not just growth, it's tremendous growth. A lot of that's driven by data centers, but also by EV load, also by home electrification and heating and appliances, some other sources. But what that does is it creates a bit of a pressure cooker for, again, these utilities and the regulators, because they're looking at increasing costs to serve all of these customers and all of this new load. And so when you have that pressure cooker, you're looking for that relief valve. And so one thing we do when we do our advocacy and education work is we frame this solution set, whether it's managed charging or bidirectional charging or both, as a relief valve. I promise I'm getting back to answer your question, which is where do we focus our efforts? It is where that relief valve is needed most. And so when you have a utility saying, not only are we expecting costs to increase, but we can't even connect some of these customers to the grid because their distribution grid, our lower voltage sort of neighborhood wires, poles and wires infrastructure is at its limit. And so we need to conduct all these infrastructure upgrades. And that not just has cost implications, but has timeline implications too, right? You can only do that so fast. You only have so much resources and materials and labor force, workforce that can do all of this. And so there's this imperative in places like the Bay Area or New York City or in many other regions like PJM, which is this mid-Atlantic and parts of the Midwest region of the power grid where you have a lot of need for new energy resources. In places like Texas where you have sort of volatility in the power market because you have maybe a lot of wind power generation at night and you're trying to get that into these areas of load or these cities have a lot of electrical demand. All that's to say is it can get very specific to the different regions, but we tend to work in places where the grid really needs help. And right now that is a lot of places. We're not necessarily short on things we need to do or places we need to show up, but we do what we can as an advocacy group to show up in all these places whether it's in the Northeast or Mid-Atlantic, in Texas or California, Colorado, Michigan, Illinois. We actually have comments going in just a few hours in New Mexico for the first time. So just showing up where we're needed and trying to, again, address those barriers and allow this to scale.
Yeah, and on that topic of one of those pressure cooker regions, you mentioned PJM, the Mid-Atlantic. I think it was last summer you guys worked with Maryland. They passed some new electric rules, very largely influenced from work you guys did and advocated for. So can you explain a little bit more of that process and what made Maryland maybe one of the earlier states to look at this seriously and what your hopes are for with those new rules and what that might enable?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, we were proud to be a part of that work. There were other stakeholders involved as well. So I want to give credit where it's due to the Public Service Commission and its staff, the utilities on the ground there in Maryland, and several other advocacy groups and companies that were involved. And all that's in the public record of the proceeding for any regulatory nerds that want to look through it. But that all started because the legislature passed the DRIVE Act, as it's known, which directs utilities to propose virtual power plant pilots and vehicle to grid pilots to tap into all these sort of latent capacity, right? I think people talk a lot about vehicle to grid and the potential there, the technical potential is huge because you do have vehicles sitting idle around 95% of the time. That's from the US Department of Energy, that statistic. So there's a lot of technical potential. It is just a matter of setting up the programs and rates to unlock it and seeing how many customers are interested in doing that and will show up and how often will they be plugging their car in and how often will they be wanting to do that? That's stuff we're still trying to find out. But back on track here. So that law went into effect and the regulator, the Public Service Commission, then established a process to update the interconnection rule, which again is the rule of the road for how distributed energy resources like rooftop solar or like batteries, like stationary battery storage can connect to the grid. What technical requirements do they need to meet? What are the processes? What are the forms you need to fill out? Some of this stuff is maybe seemingly like dry or boring for folks that aren't really into the policymaking process and the sausage making behind it. But it is really critical because that direction from the commission ultimately led to these new rules that most importantly create clarity, right? And they say, okay, we have an existing process for connecting customer-sited stationary batteries to the grid. Let's ensure that bidirectional charging systems fit into that existing process. And this is something we've seen in other states before and since then. So California, we're working on it now. In a few other places I mentioned, we've got comments going. New Mexico today, we have in Nevada, there's a proceeding we're a part of that does this. We filed comments on this in Texas. There's ongoing sort of working group discussions, and there's been votes on this in the past in New York and in Massachusetts and Connecticut. And a lot of the times it is just providing that clarity that says, if you have a bidirectional charging system, you can use this existing process we've already set up for solar and then later expanded to batteries and now expanding to bidirectional charging systems. There is some tweaking needed, and so that's a big part of the work we do. For example, this is less of a 101, more of a 201 type topic, but there's different types of bidirectional charging systems. You could have a DC bidirectional charging systems, DC referring to direct current, where the power coming off the vehicle battery and over the charging cable is DC, and then it's converted into AC power off the vehicle and used in the home or on the grid, which is AC. Or you can have the AC bidirectional charging configuration, right? Alternating current, where that conversion from DC power in the vehicle battery to AC power for use in the home or the grid happens actually on board the vehicle. And one of the things that we worked on in Maryland is to make sure there's clarity on like, how are these different systems treated? What are the technical requirements and the safety standards that need to be met? And we are really encouraged, again, through that process, through pretty good faith collaboration with the utilities and the regulator and everyone involved, to create something that works in this awkward time when the technology is still emerging and rolling out. And like I mentioned, it's something that we're replicating across the country in those other states I mentioned, and we'll see it continue to come up in new areas. And that clarity is important for customers, for installers, for the manufacturers themselves, so they can launch products, they can build a business model and say, okay, I know that if I offer this in these states, these 12 states or these 50 states or whatever it is, that customers won't be turned away by the utility, and that installers will know what is the form they need to submit and what is the timeline they can expect for its review and some of those things.
Yeah, that clarity is great because, like you said, a customer who makes a pretty substantial investment in, let's say, like a Silverado EV, and they know it has bidirectional capability. I think in the GM vehicles, it's DC and there's a external AC converter or something, right? But there's some method of getting that into AC power into the home, much like a generator or potentially an interfacing with the grid. And it sounds like in many states, that was just ambiguous or is ambiguous without rules that explicitly like think about this as an idea, in part, I guess, because it's so new and people haven't really been thinking about this at scale yet. Is that right to say?
Yeah, I think that's fair. And again, I also want this to move much faster than it is. I'll say both personally and on behalf of VGIC, I think we all do, but that safety piece is really important because we need to make sure there aren't any incidents, and we don't expect there would be. All this equipment, right? All the bidirectional charging systems marketed by GM, like you mentioned, or Ford or Tesla, or what the work that Kia is doing with their partner at Wallbox, or the work that you'll see Nissan, Volvo, and Polestar doing with Decibel. All of that is complying with the core sort of grid codes and standards. It's technical jargon, but like IEEE 1547, that's, if anyone it's super nerdy and wants to look that stuff up, that is the core safety framework for connecting to the grid, because utilities understandably want to, states as well, not just utilities, but the regulators and the DOE for that matter, right? There's general consensus that we need to make sure these systems are safe and protect users of the systems and the grid itself and doesn't damage equipment or create any incidents with shock or fire safety or anything like that. Yeah, that clarity is really important, but I do want to state that all these systems out there, they are designed around those core standards. And it is not as if they're not safe. It is just making sure that we have clear process and guidelines so that utilities can say, you're doing things that we approve of, and we're not going to come down on you for misbehaving or for acting out of compliance with our rules.
Yeah, and I know standards are a nerdy topic, and yet they are exciting in this. Like you mentioned, safety is obviously something that needs to be there when you have interest at the utilities, interest at the customers. People want equipment that is going to be safe and not cause electrical fires or service issues. At another level, also standards, I feel like, promote interoperability. And I know it's early in the space still, but like you mentioned, the Kia partnership with Wallbox, the Volvo partnership with Decibel, there's these companies, and some of them like GM and Tesla, I think, make their own equipment, or maybe they're white labeling equipment, but they have their own ecosystems for how this works. Of, okay, you buy the truck, you buy the vehicle with the battery, you also buy the thing for your wall that enables you to do the bidirectional charging. Now, that has not been very interoperable, from my understanding, up to this point. Do you have hope that that could be the case? Because I feel like right now it is a concern where someone buys a vehicle, they are locked into one ecosystem. And if, say, that's a small boutique player who decides, oh, we're not participating in your market, or for whatever reason you want to go with someone else, it's not like choosing, doesn't to me seem as mature to that level of, oh, I can switch out the box on my wall. Like I know Ford system, it's very proprietary. Lots of these manufacturers, they force you to use their system. Do you see that potentially improving, or do you think that's something that is a necessary evil as we're in such early days?
Yeah, it's a good question. I do see it improving. I also want to just quickly state that you're not necessarily locked in for charging. You can still charge other vehicles with those chargers. It's just the bidirectional charging piece that we don't have that full interoperable plug and play landscape. That being said, I do have a lot of hope because we can look at what's happening in the electric school bus market, which was kind of still is the beachhead for bidirectional charging. And we're seeing more of the vehicles and chargers both in that bidirectional school bus space complying with these open standards that enable interoperability. So both on the charger and the vehicle for that sort of vehicle to charger handshake, and then for the charger to back end management component of the ecosystem, we are starting to see much more of that interoperability. It's still not perfect because it takes time, and it's not, again, this is a frustrating thing to talk about, but it just does take time. Standards can be challenging to implement, as I understand, and I'm not a standards expert per se, as I understand it, some of the communications and interoperability standards in particular are like, there's a recipe for chocolate chip cookies, and like, Max, you and I might read the same recipe, but our cookies might taste very different, and the cookies might not talk to each other. The metaphor falls apart there. But that's I think, part of the challenge of these communications protocols and these interoperability standards where, yeah, we want to work toward that. In fact, VGIC is a signatory to the International Energy Agency's task force on this. It's called Task 53, and it is working to create broad interoperability for bidirectional charging systems. And so we're very much supportive of that. But yeah, we're not there yet on the light duty side, on the passenger EV side. As I understand it, there's general consensus that's the direction we all want to head. It's better for customers. It's better for the providers as well, right? Being able to grow the market and not have it constrained in this way is something that is very much in the theme of the high tide lifts all boats. But at the same time, like, if we jump to that now and we impose requirements, it can create implementation barriers that further delay the rollout and the scale up of these solutions. You know, those deployment pilots I mentioned earlier in California, Massachusetts, Connecticut, right? They maybe to some extent require some of these standards be met, but maybe aren't like fully baked into that because they recognize we still need to learn things from getting systems out there. And sometimes those early market sort of first generation products, it's just about getting it to work and just about getting it to, again, reveal and expose all these learnings that we need. And then that second or third or fourth gen, whatever it is, can open up toward this broader interoperable market. So all that's to say, on behalf of VGIC, we're definitely long-term supportive of that interoperable future. I think it's a matter of timing any sort of requirements very carefully so we don't accidentally constrain the market and have a smooth on-ramp onto that interoperable future. But I do have faith, and the school bus side is definitely doing it, which is great to see.
Yeah, that's great to hear from the fleet and the school bus side, and definitely a priority, I think, of mine and lots of the EV nerd listeners. And I think something that as the EV market, as we see it grow more mature and mainstream, particularly in the US, I think it'll be great to have this stuff figured out ahead of time. So it's great that people like you are working on it. The last thing I'll bring up is another barrier besides interoperability is probably like the affordability. And I know you mentioned this, that like some state public service commissions or utilities might subsidize this equipment. Because when you're looking at lots of these systems with the switches and interconnects and the charging system for your vehicle, they're much more expensive than a standard charger. We're talking like maybe over $10,000. It's like solar or batteries, right? Like maybe it can save you a lot of money, but right now the people we've seen adopting it have been early adopters who are financially very comfortable. So when you look at rate design across all the states you guys have been working in and at some of this policy stuff, what gives you hope about this becoming more affordable and maybe economies of scale starting to make this kind of more in reach for someone who's buying a new Chevy Bolt, for instance?
Yeah, I think economies of scale is certainly an important thing that we're wanting to start seeing soon. And again, it's this iterative, it's like it's not going to happen overnight. And I wish it did, but you got to get there. And that does take some of these subsidies or some of these incentives that can help offset some of the upfront cost. And so that's what we're seeing. And it might come from different places. Like in California, a lot of it's supported by the California Energy Commission with funding that they receive. In Connecticut, though, that is funded by utility ratepayers, right, through their Public Utility Regulatory Authority, sort of their utility commission, their utility regulator. In Massachusetts, it's funded through the Mass Clean Energy Center, which is as I understand it, quasi-public economic development agency that is always focused on clean energy and transportation. And we see it coming from different places, but yeah, the goal is to try to get the equipment out there, create the market so that we can evolve past subsidy and get those economies of scale, bring the cost down. Again, almost all of these systems are like first generation product. Like it is very early on the residential sort of passenger EV side, at least. And anything we could do to bridge until there is a more mature market with those economies of scale is important. I'd also note that we're maybe seeing some of the newer solutions use that AC bidirectional charging configuration where if you don't need the inverter as its own sort of box on the wall or its own component in the charging station, you might be able to cut down on system costs. And that's another development. That's more of like a step change. That is a significant drop in upfront system cost. But yeah, exciting to see more of these solutions get out there and more competition in the space, which can help drive down costs as well. But ultimately, our ask right now to a lot of policymakers is to help buy down some of the upfront costs for customers so that we can ensure this market matures and that these solutions are part of the energy toolkit in the future. So that if you're a utility or a grid operator, you can pull on a lever and turn on a gas plant, but you can also pull on a lever and turn on 10,000 bidirectional charging systems. Like that is the future that we want, 10,000 or 100,000 or however many. And the technical potential is there because there are so many EVs with more coming, but we do need to invest in creating that market now so we get there. But really exciting to see that the newer products come down a little bit in cost. And I think we'll continue to see that.
Yeah, it's so exciting to see the technology and standards develop in advance of imagine there's going to be mainstream barriers once people get to grips of, wait, you're taking energy from my car, but then you show them the stat of 90% of the time your car is sitting here, you have control, all those things. I think they'll get figured out, but it's very exciting to see the potential of this and how it's all coming together. And I will shout out to the episode we did last month with Alan Clark from Ford. I was really heartened to hear him unprompted when he was talking with the vehicle battery, talk about why he was excited that it was LFP in particular, because those batteries might be even more durable and capable for bidirectional, which is not something I asked him about, but he brought it up. Shows you lots of automakers are thinking about this. It's a huge value unlock for these vehicles as they come out. Like you said, the ecosystem of the stuff that you put on your wall is very mature. The vehicles also are not mature yet. The vehicles are also immature, but it is exciting to see them become more fleshed out, see that all figured out, especially in these EVs that are becoming more affordable and compelling for the masses to buy. So love to see it all. Thank you so much, Zach, for your time and coming on the show.
Thank you, Max. Look forward to continue listening. I guess this is a long-time listener, first-time caller. But yeah, happy to be on and would encourage folks to check out our website or LinkedIn newsletter. We do events, webinars, all that stuff to learn more about VGI. Thanks, Max.
Absolutely. We'll link those resources. This will be, I'm sure, a great episode for all the geeks. Thank you so much.
Great. Take care.
That's all for Directly Current for now. Catch us in the next month with a new episode. I've been your host, Max Patton. We're presented by EVs for All America. A big thank you one more time to Zach Woogen and the Vehicle Grid Integration Council for their time on this episode. To stay in touch with everything EVs for All America is doing, stay tuned to our website with a link in the description of this episode, evsforallamerika.org. We'll have another episode, like I said, coming next month with another guest inside of the automotive industry. There's so much exciting stuff happening between the launch of the mainstream affordable Rivian R2, the BMW iX3 and Volvo EX60 hitting Europe and the US later this year. Lots of great EV and product and charging news too, with Iona, the charging network, rapidly expanding. They just announced a deal with Circle K. We could have a whole news hour about it, but maybe that'll come later. Anyhow, in the meantime, do stay up to date on all our social channels and subscribe to this podcast if you haven't already. Until then, we'll see you next time.